Miss Trixie tells them there were 5 kids: Anton, Bill, Caleb, Diana, and Eddie. They're all different ages. Diana was not the youngest. So on Diana's row, we're going to put an X. She was not the youngest. And Caleb was not the oldest. So on Caleb's row, he's not 10 because he's not the oldest. And Anton was not the youngest nor the oldest. So Anton was not 6 and not 10. Eddie is young. He's one of the 2 youngest of the bunch. So if Eddie is one of the 2 youngest, he's not 8, 9, or 10. And Bill is one of the 2 oldest. That means Bill is not 6, 7, or 8. And oh yeah, as I watched each of those kids run to a different classroom, I realized none of their names started with the same letter as their teacher's last name. Funny what things you remember. So that means Anton did not go to Miss Abbott's class. Bill was not in Mr. Bento's class. Caleb was not in Miss Scott's class. Diana was not in Mr. Diaz's class. And Eddie was not in Miss Ng's class. So we can put X's down the middle of that, down the diagonal. I did see Mrs. Allegretti and the art teacher, Miss Flowers, near the classrooms. Maybe they can remember things. You know me, giggles Miss Flowers. I always remember colors. Caleb hates green. So we're going to go to Caleb's row. He doesn't like green, so we're going to put an X there. He refuses to have anything to do with green. Eddie had a brown backpack. Now that's something that we know. So with Eddie, we know he had a brown backpack. So when you know something, you put an O, because that's a short thing. And then if he had a brown backpack, nobody else had the brown backpack, and Eddie had no other color. So once you know something, you put an O in that cell, and X's in the rest of the column and the rest of the row. Diana didn't have a yellow or green backpack, so Diana, doesn't have the yellow and she doesn't have the green backpack. And Bill didn't have a purple or a silver one. So we go to Bill's row, and he did not have purple and he did not have silver. Now I remember the 7-year-old had a green pack. So she continues and says someone with 7 had a green. So that's something we know. So again, we're going to put an O there. And X's in the rest of that row. And X's in the rest of that column. And Mr. Diaz's student had a brown pack. So we go to Mr. Diaz's column, and his student had a brown pack. So that's here, and that's something we know. So we'll put X's in the rest of that row. And X's in the rest of that column. Well, I'm off to class, she says. Then they run over to find Miss Allegretti. Okay, and she starts by saying, the 10-year-old was screaming. Her teacher didn't like that. Well, that tells us something, that the 10-year-old was a girl, because she says her teacher didn't like that. So the 10-year-old has to be a girl, and there's only one girl, so the 10-year-old has to be Diana. So we're going to put X's in the rest of that column and X's in the rest of that row. So we know Diana is the 10-year-old. Her teacher did not like that. She told her to simmer down. That tells us another thing. That tells us that Diana's teacher is a woman. So it's not Mr. Diaz, which we already knew, and it's not Mr. Bento. This is what I can tell you about the teachers of those students. Mrs. Allegretti continues. Mr. Bento teaches 2nd grade. His students are all 7 years old. So Mr. Bento has a 7-year-old student. So put an O there, and X's in the rest of that row, and X's in the rest of that column. The kid with the green backpack went into Mr. Bento's room. So we know Mr. Bento had the student with the green backpack. So that's another thing we know. We'll put X's in the rest of that row and X's in the rest of that column. Mrs. Abbott teaches 5th grade. Her students are all 9 and 10-year-olds. So we'll go to Miss Abbott's column, and they're all 9 or 10, so they can't be 8. We know they're not 7, and they can't be 6. Mrs. Allegretti wrinkled her forehead to remember more. Miss Cott's student wasn't the oldest or the youngest, so we'll go to Miss Cott's row. Wasn't the oldest or the youngest, so not 6 and not 10. And Mr. Diaz's student was the youngest of the bunch. So we know Mr. Diaz's student was the 6-year-old. And we put X's in the rest of that column and row. And then we say, oh yes, the 8-year-old had a silver backpack. So we go to the 8-year-old's row, and that was a silver backpack. So that's something we know. We put X's in the rest of that column and X's in the rest of that row. He almost tripped on Ms. Eng as he pushed into her class. So the 8-year-old has a silver backpack and is part of Miss Eng's class, so that's another thing we know. So we put X's in the rest of that row and column. And we know that he had the silver backpack, so we put X's in the rest of that column and row. And we know the 8-year-old was a boy because he almost tripped on Miss Eng. So the 8-year-old then has to be a boy, which we already knew because Diana is 10-year-old. So we already crossed her out in the 8-year-old column. Okay, now we want to look and see what we can tell from the different squares that we already have identified.